In the tragic history of how great nations eventually die, there is usually the deafening sound of cannon fire or the rhythmic marching of boots. We instinctively expect the screaming of falling shells and the violent clash of steel to mark the catastrophic end of a powerful era. However, in the 19th century, the greatest empire of the Middle East was dismantled not by soldiers on the battlefield, but by accountants in quiet rooms. This colossal power was conquered not with the explosive force of gunpowder, but with the silent and mathematical lethality of compound interest. This is the untold story of the first true debt trap in modern history, a financial weapon that destroyed a superpower from within. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, a titan that had terrified Europe for centuries, was slowly suffocated by the banks of London and Paris. It is a cautionary tale that echoes loudly in our modern world, because it demonstrates a brutal and timeless geopolitical truth. The lesson is that you do not need to invade a country with armies to own it. You simply need to hold its mortgage. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look at the Ottoman Empire as it stood in the middle of the 19th century. To the outside observer, it still appeared to be a titan, stretching from the Balkans in Europe across the mountains of Anatolia. The domains of the Sultan reached down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and sprawled across the burning deserts of North Africa. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions of loyal subjects and sat on a throne that commanded the vital crossroads of the known world. But beneath this glittering surface of imperial majesty and ancient tradition, the economic foundation was rotting away and the empire was economically sick. While Britain and France were undergoing the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines and factories, the Ottoman economy remained frozen in a medieval agrarian past. It was a land of peasants and craftsmen trying to compete in a ruthless new world dominated by efficient machines and mass production. The treasuries of the Sultan were chronically short of cash, unable to generate the revenue required to maintain such a vast territory. The tax system was archaic and inefficient, relying on corrupt local officials who stole half the revenue before it ever reached the capital city. For centuries, the Ottomans had solved their cash flow problems by debasing their currency or simply confiscating the accumulated wealth of rich officials. But in the modern era, these medieval tricks no longer worked, and the empire desperately needed access to capital to survive. It needed to build a modern army to defend itself against the predatory Russian Empire that was looming dangerously to the north. To survive in this new era, the empire needed to construct paved roads and install telegraph lines across its vast territories. It desperately needed to look and act like a modern European power, projecting strength and stability to its neighbors. For a long time, the sultans had stubbornly resisted the temptation to borrow money from the wealthy nations of the West. There was a deep cultural and religious aversion to usury and a political fear of becoming dependent on the Christian powers. But in 1853, the dam finally broke when the Russian Empire invaded Ottoman territory, sparking the Crimean War. This was a conflict of massive scale and expense that the Ottomans could not possibly afford to fight on their own. Britain and France, terrified of Russian expansion into the Mediterranean, stepped in to help the Turks defend their lands. They sent vast armies and powerful fleets to the Black Sea, but crucially, they also sent their bankers. The war was costing the Ottoman treasury millions of gold liras that it simply did not have in its vault. The soldiers needed to be paid, the cannons needed to be cast, and the ships needed to be fully provisioned. The Sultan Abdülmecid was desperate, watching his resources dwindle while the demands of war grew larger every single day. His trusted advisors told him there was no other choice and that the survival of the state was at stake. To save the empire, he had to break the ancient taboo that had kept his ancestors free from foreign debt. He had to take a loan, a decision that would change the course of Ottoman history forever. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers. It was presented to the public as a lifeline, a noble gesture of solidarity from allies fighting a common enemy. But, in reality, it was the first shackle of the golden handcuffs that would eventually bind the empire completely. The bankers knew the Ottomans were a high credit risk, so they demanded a steep price for their assistance. The issue price was set at 80, meaning for every £100 of debt signed, the Sultan received only 80. The bank kept the difference as a massive commission and a risk premium, instantly profiting from the empire's desperation. However, the empire was legally obligated to pay interest on the full £100, regardless of the cash actually received. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance, a mathematical trap that ensured the debt would grow faster than the economy. They were borrowing money at an effective interest rate that was punishingly high while receiving far less cash than they owed. But when the cash finally arrived in Istanbul, it felt like a divine miracle to the beleaguered government officials. Suddenly, the army could be paid, the supplies could be bought, and the immediate crisis of the war was averted. The Russians were eventually defeated in the Crimea, and the Sultan felt a tremendous rush of relief and renewed power. He believed he had discovered a magic trick that could solve all the complex problems of his faltering empire. He realized that with a simple signature on a piece of paper in London, he could summon fleets of gold. The war ended in 1856, but the borrowing did not stop when the cannons finally fell silent. The Sultan and the Ottoman elite had tasted the forbidden fruit of easy credit, and they became addicted almost instantly. They looked toward the shining capitals of London and Paris with a mix of admiration and deep envy. They saw gaslit boulevards, magnificent marble opera houses, and a lifestyle that projected infinite wealth and cultural superiority. They felt a deep and stinging sense of inferiority, fearing they were being left behind by the march of progress. They desperately wanted Istanbul to look like a modern European capital, to mirror the grandeur of the West. They wanted to prove to the skeptical world that they were not the sick man of Europe, but a wealthy power. So they began to spend. But they did not spend the borrowed money on factories that would produce goods. They did not invest in irrigation systems for farmers or education for the people, things that would generate a return. Instead, they squandered the loans on prestige, on the appearance of wealth rather than the creation of it. They poured millions into the ultimate symbol of imperial vanity, a project designed to dazzle the eyes of Europe. This was the Dolmabahçe Palace, a construction project so expensive it would help drag the empire into the abyss. Sultan Abdülmecid decided that the old Topkapı Palace, the home of his ancestors for 400 years, was too old-fashioned. He felt it was too Asian and archaic, wanting a residence that rivaled the splendor of Versailles in France. He wanted a palace that would make Queen Victoria jealous and prove the Ottoman Empire was still a global contender. So he ordered the construction of a massive edifice on the shores of the Bosphorus, regardless of the astronomical cost. The Dolmabahçe Palace is a building of staggering opulence, a physical manifestation of an empire trying to buy respect. It is filled with 14 tons of gold leaf covering the ceilings, shimmering in the reflected light of the sea. It contains the largest crystal chandelier in the world, a heavy and fragile gift sent from the British Queen. The famous staircase is made of baccarat crystal, and the walls are lined with expensive imported Italian marble. It is a breathtakingly beautiful building, but historically speaking, it serves as a magnificent tombstone for the dying empire. It was built entirely with borrowed money, paid for by loans that the state could never hope to repay. While the peasants of Anatolia were scratching a living from the dry earth using primitive wooden plows, the Sultan was importing fragile crystal from Bohemia and gold from France to decorate a house he could not afford. The cost of the palace was 5 million Ottoman gold liras, a sum that boggles the mind even today. This amount was the equivalent of a quarter of the entire yearly tax revenue of the vast Ottoman Empire. To pay for this madness, the Sultan went back to the bankers in 1855, and then again later. Each time, the bankers in London and Paris were happy to lend, eager to keep the profitable cycle going. They were making a fortune on the commissions and the high interest rates charged to the desperate treasury. They knew the empire was struggling, but they assumed that Britain and France would never let the Ottomans fail. This is the dangerous economic concept of moral hazard, where risks are taken because a government bailout is expected. By the 1860s, the Ottoman financial situation had turned into a classic and unsustainable Ponzi scheme. The empire was simply not generating enough tax revenue to pay the compounding interest on the old loans. So, it was forced to take out new loans just to pay the interest on the previous ones. They were literally digging a deeper hole to fill an existing hole, a strategy that was doomed to fail. By 1860, the empire was spending perhaps 15% of its total income on debt service. By 1870, that number had risen to over 50% of the entire state budget. Think about the staggering implications of that figure for a developing nation trying to modernize its infrastructure. 50 cents of every dollar collected from a fisherman in Greece or a farmer in Syria left immediately. It left the country instantly to pay a coupon to a wealthy bondholder sitting comfortably in London. That meant there was no money left for the army, the navy, schools, or basic infrastructure. The state was being hollowed out from the inside, leaving only a brittle shell of its former self. To keep the system going, the government turned to a group of local financiers known as the Galata bankers. These were mostly wealthy Greek and Armenian families who lived and operated in the Galata district of Istanbul. When the treasury ran dry before the next big European loan came in, the Grand Vizier went to them. He would borrow money at punishing short-term rates of 18%, 20%, or even higher. It was financial suicide, accelerated by the new Sultan, Abdulaziz, who had succeeded his brother to the throne. Abdulaziz was a man with a massive ego and a dangerous love for expensive military hardware. He didn't just build palaces. He looked at the British Royal Navy and decided he wanted one too. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards and the latest steel cannons from German factories. For a brief moment, the Ottoman Navy was the third largest in the world on paper. But it was a fleet the empire could not afford to fuel, maintain, or even sail out of port. The expensive ironclad ships sat rusting in the Golden Horn because there was no coal to fuel them. The tipping point finally arrived in 1873 when a financial panic started in Vienna and spread globally. This panic caused a severe economic depression known as the Long Depression, drying up global capital markets. The European banks, suffering their own liquidity crisis, stopped lending, and the music finally stopped for the Sultan. At the exact same time, nature turned against the Ottomans with a catastrophic drought striking the heartland. The crops failed completely across Anatolia in 1873, and the sheep died in the parched fields. The peasants who formed the tax base of the empire faced starvation as famine stalked the land. Tax collectors went into the villages demanding payment and found nothing but dust, despair, and unburied corpses. The revenue stream collapsed entirely, but the debt payments to foreign bankers remained fixed and unyielding. In the summer of 1875, the Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha realized the game was finally up. The treasury was empty, a massive payment was due in October, and there was simply no cash. He tried to float a new loan, but the markets were closed to the sick man of Europe. The empire faced a brutal choice: starve its own people to pay bankers or stop paying the debt. On October 6, 1875, the government issued a decree that shook the financial pillars of Europe. Known as the Decree of Ramadan, the government announced it would cut its debt payments in half immediately. It would pay 50% in cash and the other 50% in paper notes, promising a return. In the polite language of diplomacy, this was a moratorium. But in the brutal language of finance, it was default. The reaction in Europe was furious, as millions of middle-class investors saw their savings wiped out overnight. The diplomatic support that Britain and France had previously given the Ottomans against Russia evaporated in an instant. Seeing that the Sultan was broke and friendless, the Russian Empire saw a golden opportunity to finish the job. In 1877, Russia officially declared war, seizing the perfect opportunity to destroy its weakened and bankrupt rival. The Russo-Turkish War was an absolute disaster for the Ottomans, completely exposing their hollowed-out state to the world. The Ottoman army fought with desperate bravery, but they were unpaid, undersupplied, and deeply demoralized by their government's failure. The Russian forces marched relentlessly, all the way to the suburbs of Istanbul, within sight of the Hagia Sophia. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding vast and valuable territories in the Balkans and Caucasus. But the most devastating clause of this peace treaty was not territorial, but financial, designed to cripple the state. The Russians imposed a massive war indemnity, demanding that the Ottomans pay them over 800 million francs as punishment. Now, the Ottoman Empire was trapped in a truly impossible position, crushed between Western bankers and Russian generals. It owed hundreds of millions of pounds to the British and French bankers, debt which it had already defaulted on. On top of that old burden, it now owed a massive new war debt to the Russian Tsar. The total debt load was now far greater than the entire value of the Ottoman economy could possibly support. The empire was completely insolvent, defenseless, and had lost its credit, its territory, and its last shred of dignity. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who had ascended the throne during this chaos, sat in his palace, realizing the grim truth. He knew that he was effectively the ruler of a corpse, a state that had died but refused to fall. He waited for the European powers to finally carve up his lands and dissolve the empire once and for all. But the British and the French governments had a different idea, one that was far more sophisticated and cynical. They did not want to conquer the Ottoman Empire territorially because that would be messy, expensive, and spark wars. Occupying the land would require sending armies, building administrations, and governing millions of angry and rebellious subjects. They had a much smarter idea, realizing that if they simply annexed the Ottoman economy, they could extract wealth indefinitely. They could drain the resources of the empire without the hassle, risk, or expense of actually governing the people. In 1881, the representatives of the European bondholders arrived in Istanbul to formalize their control. These conquerors were not generals riding horses. They were bankers carrying briefcases and wearing expensive suits. They sat down with the defeated Ottoman officials and calmly dictated the absolute terms of their financial surrender. They were not asking for land or cities. They were asking for the rights to the empire's cash flow. This negotiation led to the Decree of Muharram, issued in December 1881, a document of historical tragedy. It was effectively the death certificate of Ottoman independence and the birth certificate of the modern debt trap. It established an organization that was unique in the history of imperialism called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was the mechanism of the soft conquest, a tool designed to harvest wealth without planting a single flag. The OPDA was not a government agency. It was a private corporation run by a foreign board. Its directors represented the powerful banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was headquartered in a massive, fortress-like building in Istanbul that loomed physically over the capital city. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable and reliable sources of revenue directly to this foreign corporation. The Sultan effectively agreed that he could no longer be trusted to collect his own taxes. The taxes on the lucrative silk trade were handed over entirely to the control of the OPDA. The taxes on salt, a vital commodity for every household, were also handed over to the foreign bankers. The taxes on fishing, spirits, tobacco, and the stamp duty on legal documents were all legally transferred. The OPDA built its own massive bureaucracy, hiring over 5,000 dedicated tax collectors to do the work. These men wore special uniforms, carried weapons, and answered not to the Sultan, but to the board of directors. They fanned out across the empire, from the mountains of Macedonia to the coastal markets of Syria. They went into the villages and the markets to collect the wealth of the Ottoman people for foreign creditors. Unlike the notoriously corrupt Ottoman bureaucracy, the OPDA was run with ruthless efficiency and modern European accounting standards. They built modern warehouses, improved salt mines, and distributed disease-free silkworm eggs to farmers to boost production. They actually succeeded in growing the economy, but they grew it strictly for the benefit of foreign creditors, not citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly one-third of the total revenue of the empire. Think about that figure. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by the hard work of the people was siphoned off abroad. The Ottoman government was left with the scraps, forced to run a massive empire with only 2/3 of its own tax base. This meant the state remained perpetually poor, unable to invest in education, build industries, or modernize its crumbling infrastructure. They were trapped in a cycle of underdevelopment because their surplus capital was being extracted by the debt trap. The Sultan became a puppet in his own house. He reigned over the people, but the OPDA ruled the money. If he wanted to build a school or a road, he practically had to ask the bankers for permission. But the debt trap didn't just extract money, it extracted sovereignty and opened the door for a new player, Germany. While Britain and France were content to squeeze the Ottomans for cash, Germany saw a massive strategic opportunity. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Istanbul and embraced the Sultan, claiming that Germany was a true friend. He told the Ottomans that the British and French were parasites who only wanted to bleed them dry. Germany proposed a massive infrastructure project that would change the map of the world, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It was a dream of steel connecting the heart of Europe to the oil fields of the Middle East. This railway would bypass the British-controlled Suez Canal, threatening the maritime dominance of the British Empire. For the Sultan, this was a lifeline that would allow him to move troops quickly to suppress internal rebellions. But with the treasury empty and controlled by the OPDA, the question remained: who would pay for it? The Germans smiled and said, not to worry, for they would lend the money, starting a new cycle of debt. Deutsche Bank became the primary financier, but the contracts for the railway were just as extortionate as the British loans. They included kilometric guarantees, forcing the Ottoman government to pay a guaranteed profit for every single mile of track laid. Crucially, the contracts gave German companies exclusive rights to all oil and minerals found within 20 kilometers of the tracks. The Sultan had simply swapped the golden handcuffs of the British bankers for the heavy steel chains of the Germans. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire was effectively a German economic colony, with its army and railways run by Berlin. When World War I broke out, the Ottoman leadership made a fatal calculation to join Germany, hoping to cancel their debts. They believed that if they won the war, they could abolish the OPDA and finally regain their independence. On the day they declared war, they marched to the OPDA headquarters and expelled the British and French directors. For a brief and intoxicating moment, they felt the rush of freedom, but the gamble failed catastrophically. The empire was destroyed in the fire of war. But while the nation died, the debt refused to die. When the Turkish Republic was founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1923, the creditors returned with their ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, the British and French argued that because Turkey inherited the land, it inherited the mortgage. Atatürk fought hard, but he knew the new nation could not enter the modern world as a defaulter. So, the poor and devastated republic spent its first 30 years sending millions of dollars abroad to pay for the Sultan's mistakes. The final payment on the Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954, exactly 100 years after the first loan. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is the ultimate lesson in the terrifying danger of financial dependency. The Ottomans thought they could buy the appearance of a great power using other people's money. They proved that the most effective way to destroy an empire is not to attack it, but to lend it money. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. For if you do not own your debt, it owns you. I am John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe to stay ahead of the curve.